The evening sky turned a deep purple as Richard Winters guided his sleek black car into the parking lot of Sunshine Diner. It wasn't the kind of place he normally stopped at. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the building's paint had seen better days. But his son Alex was hungry, and after a long day of doctors and disappointments, Richard didn't have the energy to drive another hour to the city. "We won't stay long," Richard said, more to himself than to Alex. He glanced at his watch, a habit he couldn't break, and calculated how quickly they could eat and get back on the road. Alex didn't respond. The 16-year-old boy sat quietly, in his wheelchair, which Richard carefully unfolded after helping him out of the car. Alex's hands rested in his lap, occasionally twitching with the involuntary movements caused by his cerebral palsy. His eyes, though, those were fully alive, taking in everything around him with an intelligence that many people missed when they first met him. "Ready?" Richard asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Another tough doctor's appointment. Another specialist with nothing new to offer, despite the ridiculous amount of money Richard had paid. 12 years of wealth built from his tech company, and he still couldn't fix what mattered most. The diner's door was heavy, and Richard had to maneuver carefully to hold it open while pushing Alex's wheelchair through. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. A jukebox in the corner played old songs, and the buzz of conversation dropped slightly as they entered. Richard felt the familiar weight of eyes on them, on Alex before people politely looked away. "Table for two?" A middle-aged woman asked from behind the counter. "Yes, somewhere with space for the wheelchair, please," Richard replied, his voice carrying the clipped tone he used for business calls. He followed the woman to a corner booth where she removed a chair to make room for Alex's wheelchair. "Your server will be right with you," she said, handing them menus before hurrying back to the counter. Richard glanced around the diner. It was nearly full. Families with children, couples on dates, truck drivers stopping for coffee. Normal people living normal lives. Sometimes Richard wondered what that felt like. "What looks good to you?" he asked Alex, holding the menu where his son could see it. Alex took his time answering, working to form each word clearly. "Cheeseburger and chocolate shake." Richard nodded. "Sounds good. Dr. Gibson said we need to get more calories into you anyway." He didn't add that the doctor had also said there was nothing more they could do about Alex's motor control, that the new treatment they'd traveled across 3 states to learn about wasn't suitable for Alex's case. A young woman approached their table, notepad in hand and a warm smile on her face. Her name tag read Tiana. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her uniform was crisp despite the late hour. "Welcome to Sunshine Diner," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Can I start y'all with something to drink?" Richard barely looked up. "Water for me. My son wants a chocolate shake." But Tiana didn't write this down immediately. Instead, she turned directly to Alex. "And how are you doing tonight, young man? That shake comes with whipped cream on top? That okay with you?" Alex's face brightened instantly. "Yes, please," he said, the words coming out slowly but clearly. Richard looked up, surprised. Most servers directed all their questions to him as if Alex couldn't speak for himself. He studied Tiana more carefully now. She was probably in her late 20s with kind eyes and an easy confidence about her. "And for you, sir?" she asked, turning back to Richard. "Just water is fine. We'll both have cheeseburgers." "Any particular sides with those? We've got fries, onion rings, or coleslaw." Again, she looked at Alex first, waiting patiently as he considered, and then said, "Fries, please." "Same," Richard added, closing his menu. As Tiana walked away, Richard checked his emails on his phone. 3 urgent messages from his executive team about the upcoming product launch, a reminder about tomorrow's board meeting, a note from Alex's school about an upcoming science fair. Richard sighed and put the phone away. He'd deal with it all later. "How are you holding up, buddy?" he asked Alex, making an effort to really look at his son. "I'm okay," Alex replied. "Just tired." Richard nodded. "Me too." 3 years since Helen had died, and he still didn't know how to do this. How to be both mother and father. How to connect with his son beyond the endless rounds of doctors and therapists. Helen had made it look so easy. She'd known how to make Alex laugh, how to create moments of joy even on the hardest days. Tiana returned with their drinks, placing Alex's milkshake carefully within his reach. She'd added an extra long straw and positioned it just right so he could drink without struggling. "Your burgers will be out in about 10 minutes, she said. "Let me know if you need anything else." As she moved away, the song on the jukebox changed. The opening beats of Billie Jean filled the diner, and Richard noticed Alex's fingers immediately start tapping against his wheelchair armrest. "You still love Michael Jackson, huh?" Richard said, smiling slightly at this familiar sign of his son's enjoyment. Alex nodded, his body swaying slightly to the rhythm. "Mom used to dance with me to this," he said quietly. The comment hit Richard like a physical blow. Helen would put on Michael Jackson records and dance around the living room, sometimes lifting Alex from his wheelchair to sway with him in her arms. As Alex grew older and heavier, she'd found other ways to include him, spinning his wheelchair, holding his hands while they moved to the beat together. Richard had always watched from the doorway, smiling at their happiness but never joining in. The memory hung between them now, both painful and precious. Richard didn't know what to say. He never knew what to say when Alex mentioned Helen. Tiana approached with their food, setting the plates down carefully. As she placed Alex's burger in front of him, she noticed his fingers tapping to the music. "You've got good taste," she said, smiling at Alex. "Michael Jackson fan?" Alex's face lit up. "Yes, this is one of my favorites." "Mine too," Tiana replied. She glanced around the diner, which had quieted down as several parties had left. Then she looked back at Alex, a sparkle in her eye. "You know, I think this song deserves more than just finger tapping." Richard watched, confused, as Tiana set down her serving tray and stepped back from their table. She extended her hand toward Alex. "Would you like to dance?" she asked. Richard felt a flash of protective anger. Was she making fun of Alex? But one look at her face told him she was completely sincere. Alex looked as shocked as Richard felt. I can't really dance," he said, gesturing to his wheelchair. "Sure you can," Tiana replied. "If you'd like to, that is, no pressure." Alex looked at Richard, a question in his eyes. Richard found himself nodding, though his heart raced with uncertainty. With gentle movements, Tiana took hold of Alex's wheelchair handles. "You lead with your hands," she told him. "I'll follow your rhythm." As the chorus of Billie Jean played, Tiana began to move, guiding Alex's wheelchair in a gentle spin while dancing alongside him. She took his hands when he offered them, allowing him to set the pace and direction of their movement. Richard sat frozen, his burger forgotten. He'd spent millions on treatments and therapies, searching the world for ways to improve Alex's life. And here was this waitress in a roadside diner, creating pure joy with nothing but kindness and music. Alex was laughing now, his face transformed with delight as Tiana spun him carefully between tables. A few other diners had noticed, but instead of the pitying looks Richard expected, people were smiling. An elderly man tapped his hand on the counter to the beat. A little girl watched wide-eyed, then whispered something to her mother about the dancing boy. For 3 minutes, Richard saw his son not as a medical challenge or a reminder of his failures as a father, but simply as a teenager having fun. When the song ended, Tiana high-fived Alex and returned to her duties as if what she'd done wasn't extraordinary at all. "That was awesome," Alex said, his breathing quick with excitement as he returned to their table. His eyes followed Tiana as she moved around the diner, a new confidence in his expression. Richard struggled to find words. "She seems nice," he finally managed, which felt ridiculously inadequate. "She didn't treat me like I'm broken," Alex said, quietly. "Most people do, you know. Even you sometimes, Dad." The simple truth of those words struck Richard like a lightning bolt. He'd been so focused on fixing Alex that he'd forgotten to see him, really see him, as he was right now. As they finished their meal, Richard found himself watching Tiana with the other customers. The way she remembered everyone's names, how she joked with the kitchen staff. The respect with which she treated an elderly man who seemed confused about his order. There was something in her easy kindness that reminded him of Helen. When Tiana brought their check, Richard reached for his wallet. "Thank you," he said, looking directly at her for the first time. For the dance. It meant a lot to him. Tiana smiled. "No thanks needed, it was my pleasure." She hesitated, then added, "He's a great kid. You should be proud." "I am," Richard said, and realized he meant it. Not proud of what Alex might someday become if the right treatment was found, but proud of who he already was. As they left the diner, Alex couldn't stop talking. More words than Richard had heard from him in months. And as Richard helped him back into the car, he found himself wondering about Tiana, about this unlikely place where his son had experienced a moment of pure joy, and about what other simple opportunities for happiness he might have been missing all along. The drive home from Sunshine Diner felt different. Richard glanced at Alex in the rearview mirror, surprised to see his son still smiling. Usually after doctor appointments, the car would fill with heavy silence, both of them lost in their own disappointment. But tonight, Alex couldn't stop talking. "Did you see how she spun my chair, Dad? And how everyone was watching? Not because they felt sorry for me, but because it looked cool." Richard nodded, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel. "It did look cool," he admitted. In truth, it had looked like much more than that. It had looked like freedom. "Tiana said everyone can dance their own way," Alex continued. "She said movement is about joy, not rules." He paused, his excitement momentarily giving way to a more thoughtful expression. "Mom used to say something like that too." Richard swallowed hard. "She did, didn't she?" The mention of Helen no longer felt like a knife to the chest. Instead, it felt like a gentle reminder of something precious they'd both lost, but also something they could still honor by remembering. As they pulled into the driveway of their sprawling mansion, the security lights flickered on automatically. Richard helped Alex out of the car and into his wheelchair with practiced movements. The house staff had gone home hours ago, leaving the massive house quiet and oddly empty. "Dad?" Alex asked, as Richard pushed him up the wheelchair ramp to the front door. "Could we go back to that diner sometime?" Richard hesitated only briefly. "Sure, buddy, we can go back." Later, after getting Alex settled in bed, Richard sat in his home office, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing it. The quarterly. Reports from his company, Winters Tech Solutions, needed his review, but his mind kept drifting back to the diner, to the waitress whose simple act of kindness had somehow cut through 3 years of grief and disconnection. He pulled out his wallet and found the receipt from Sunshine Diner. He'd left a $200 tip on a $30 meal, but even as he'd done it, he'd known it wasn't enough. Money had always been his solution to everything, yet tonight it had felt hollow, inadequate. Richard opened his browser and searched for Sunshine Diner. The place had a simple website with its hours menu and a brief history. It had been open for nearly 40 years, started by a woman named Louise Sullivan, who had passed it down to her daughter Grace. Nothing fancy, just a family business that had somehow survived in an age of fast food chains and trendy eateries. On impulse, Richard opened his calendar app. Tomorrow was packed with meetings, a product development review at 9 a.m., lunch with investors, a conference call with their overseas manufacturing team. He hesitated only briefly before clearing the entire morning. His assistant would be shocked, but for once that didn't matter. Richard slept better that night than he had in months. The next morning, after seeing Alex off to school with his aide, Richard drove back to Sunshine Diner. It looked different in the daylight. Smaller, more worn around the edges. The parking lot had a few cars, mostly older models, a far cry from the luxury vehicles that filled the parking garage at his company headquarters. Richard hesitated before going in. What was he doing here? What did he expect to accomplish? He almost turned around, but the memory of Alex's face, as he danced with Tiana, pushed him forward. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The breakfast crowd was thinning out, with just a few tables occupied. Richard looked around for Tiana but didn't see her. Instead, An older woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun approached him. "Just one today?" she asked, grabbing a menu. "Actually," Richard said, "I was hoping to speak with one of your waitresses. Tiana? She served my son and me last night." The woman's expression changed slightly, becoming more guarded. "Tiana doesn't come in until the afternoon shift. Is there a problem with your service last night?" "No, not at all," Richard hurried to explain. "Quite the opposite. My son has cerebral palsy and Tiana, she danced with him. It meant a lot to us both." The woman's face softened immediately. "You must be the big tipper with the boy in the wheelchair. Tiana mentioned you. I'm Grace Sullivan, the owner." She extended her hand. Richard shook it. "Richard Winters." Something flickered in Grace's eyes at the name. "As in Winters Tech Solutions?" Richard nodded, used to being recognized. His face had been on the cover of business magazines, his company's rise from startup to tech giant, documented extensively in the financial press. "Well, Mr. Winters, Tiana won't be in until 3. But you're welcome to have some coffee while you wait or come back later." Richard checked his watch, a habit he couldn't seem to break. It was only 9:30 a.m. "I'll come back," he decided. "But while I'm here, could you tell me a bit about this place? It seems special." Grace studied him for a moment, then gestured to a booth. "Coffee's on the house, and I've got 20 minutes before the lunch prep starts." Over surprisingly good coffee, Grace told Richard about Sunshine Diner, how her mother had started it after Grace's father died, leaving her with 3 young children and no income, how they'd nearly lost it twice over the years to rising costs and chain competition, how Grace had taken over 15 years ago when her mother's arthritis made it too difficult to continue. "We're hanging on by a thread these days," Grace admitted, "but we've got loyal customers and good staff." She smiled. "Tiana's one of the best, been with us 3 years now. She's putting herself through nursing school, working here, and another job at the hospital gift shop." Richard found himself genuinely interested. "Nursing school?" Grace nodded. "She's got away with people who need extra care. Her younger brother has Down syndrome, so she grew up understanding difference, if you know what I mean." That explained Tiana's natural ease with Alex. She'd seen his humanity before his disability, something Richard realized he sometimes failed to do with his own son. "The place means something to the community," Richard observed, looking around at the worn but clean diner, the photos on the wall showing decades of customers and staff, the sense of history and belonging. "It does," Grace agreed. "For some folks, we're the only family meal they get. For others, we're the only place they can afford a hot breakfast. And for some of my staff, we're the only place that would hire them." She gave him a direct look. Not everyone wants to take a chance on a single mom with no experience, or a kid with a learning disability, or someone trying to rebuild after a rough patch. Richard felt a twinge of discomfort. His own company had strict hiring practices, multiple rounds of interviews, degree requirements. How many Tianas had they overlooked? "Anyway," Grace said, finishing her coffee, "that's our little corner of the world. Not very exciting compared to the tech industry, I'm sure." "Actually," Richard said, surprising himself, "it's exactly what I needed to hear today." After leaving the diner, Richard found himself driving aimlessly, his thoughts churning. He ended up at a small park near Alex's school. Sitting on a bench, he pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel my afternoon too," he said, ignoring her surprised questions. "And reschedule tomorrow's meetings. I need some time to think." For years, Richard had measured success in stock prices and profit margins, in technological breakthroughs and market share. He'd applied the same approach to Alex's condition, throwing money at the problem, expecting results, growing frustrated when progress was slow or non-existent. But last night he'd witnessed something money couldn't buy: joy, connection, acceptance. The things Helen had naturally given their son, the things Richard had never quite figured out how to provide. At 3 o'clock, Richard returned to Sunshine Diner. The lunch rush was over, and only a few tables were occupied. Tiana was wiping down a counter, her back to the door when he entered. She turned at the sound of the bell, recognition dawning on her face. "Mr. Winters," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything okay? Is Alex all right?" The immediate concern for his son touched Richard. "Alex is fine. Better than fine. Actually, he hasn't stopped talking about dancing with you." Tiana's face broke into a warm smile. "He's a great kid. Really good rhythm, too." Richard hesitated, suddenly unsure why he'd come. He'd rehearsed what to say in his car, but now the words seemed inadequate. "I wanted to thank you properly," he finally said. "What you did for Alex, it wasn't just a dance, I haven't seen him that happy in years." Tiana's expression softened. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Winters. Everyone deserves to dance if they want to." "But most people don't see it that way," Richard countered. "Most people see the wheelchair first. They see the limitations, not the possibilities." Tiana shrugged, but her eyes held understanding. "My brother Thomas has Down syndrome. People underestimate him all the time. They talk to him like he's 5 years old, even though he's 22 and works at the library." Richard nodded, thinking of how often people addressed him instead of Alex. "I came here today because—" He paused, organizing his thoughts. "Because I realized I've been one of those people, even with my own son. I've been so focused on fixing him that I forgot to see who he already is." The honesty in his words surprised even himself. Tiana seemed equally surprised, but recovered quickly. "It's not easy being a parent," she said kindly, "especially when your child faces challenges." "No, it's not," Richard agreed. "But that's no excuse." He looked around the diner, at its worn charm and warm atmosphere. "This place is special. Grace told me a bit about it this morning." "You met Grace?" Tiana asked, raising an eyebrow. "I did. She told me you're in nursing school." Tiana nodded. "Last year. If all goes well, I graduate in 5 months." Richard took a deep breath. "I'd like to help if you'll let me. A scholarship, maybe. Or an internship at one of the medical facilities my company partners with." Tiana's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "That's very generous, Mr. Winters, but it's not charity," Richard interrupted, sensing her hesitation. "Consider it payment for the most valuable lesson I've received in years." He smiled slightly. "Besides, Alex wants to come back and dance again. I'd hate to tell him his dance partner has moved on." That made Tiana laugh. "Well, when you put it that way—" She paused, considering. "How about this? Bring Alex back for dinner sometime. Get to know this place, these people. Then we can talk about what kind of help would actually make a difference, not just for me, but maybe for the diner, too." Richard found himself nodding. It wasn't the quick transaction he was used to, the easy exchange of money for services or results. It was something more complex, more human. "It's a deal," he said, extending his hand. As they shook on it, Richard felt something shift inside him. The first small step in a transformation that had begun with a dance and might lead somewhere he'd never expected to go. 3 days later, Richard sat in his corner office overlooking the city skyline, barely listening as his executive team presented the quarterly projections. Normally, he would be fully engaged, asking pointed questions, demanding clearer strategies. Today, his mind kept drifting back to Sunshine Diner. "Mr. Winters?" His chief financial officer, Philip, cleared his throat. "Your thoughts on the expansion timeline?" Richard blinked, forcing himself back to the present. "Sorry, could you repeat the question?" Concerned glances passed between his executives. Richard Winters was never distracted, never unfocused. His legendary attention to detail had built their company from a small tech startup to an industry giant. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" asked Linda, his chief operating officer. Richard considered the question. Was he all right? Physically, yes, but something had shifted inside him since that night at the diner. Like a puzzle piece that had been forced into the wrong spot for years had finally found its proper place. "I'm fine," he said, straightening in his chair. "But I want to discuss something new today." He closed the financial report in front of him. What are we doing about accessibility in our products? The question was met with blank stares. Accessibility? Philip repeated cautiously. Yes, for users with disabilities. How are we making sure our technology works for everyone? Richard leaned forward, suddenly energized. We've built an empire on making tech that's sleek, efficient, and cutting edge. But have we stopped to consider who might be left behind? His team exchanged uncomfortable glances. We comply with all regulations, offered Diane from the legal department. All our software meets the minimum accessibility requirements. Minimum, Richard repeated. That's not good enough anymore. For the next hour, Richard steered the meeting in a completely new direction, shocking his team with questions they'd never considered and ideas they'd never explored. By the end, he'd tasked each department head with a complete review of their products and services through the lens of accessibility and inclusion. As the executives filed out, Linda lingered behind. She'd been with Richard almost from the beginning, one of the few people who could speak frankly with him. This is about Alex, isn't it? She asked quietly. Richard nodded. Partly, but it's bigger than that. He struggled to put his thoughts into words. We've been solving the wrong problems, Linda, creating technology that makes life better for people who already have it pretty good. We've built a billion-dollar company doing exactly that, she pointed out. Yes, and now we have the resources to do more. Richard stood looking out at the city below. I want us to become leaders in adaptive technology, not just meeting minimum requirements, but setting new standards. Linda studied him carefully. This is a major pivot, Richard. The board will have questions. Let them question. I'll have answers. For the first time in years, Richard felt absolute clarity about the direction he wanted to take. Set up a meeting with the research and development team for tomorrow, and find me the best accessibility consultants in the country. After Linda left, Richard checked his watch. Alex would be finishing physical therapy soon. On impulse, he called his driver and canceled his remaining meetings. He wanted to pick up his son himself. The therapy center was housed in a modern medical building across town. Richard rarely went inside, usually sending Alex's aide or waiting in the car during sessions. Today, he walked through the glass doors and into the bright open room where various patients worked with therapists. He spotted Alex in the corner, practicing with arm weights under the guidance of his therapist, Ken. Richard stood back, watching his son's determined face as he struggled to complete each repetition. The boy's forehead was beaded with sweat, but his eyes showed fierce concentration. You're doing great, Alex, Ken encouraged. 3 more, and we're done for today. Richard felt a surge of pride as Alex pushed through, completing the set despite his obvious fatigue. He'd always known his son was receiving excellent care, but he realized now he'd rarely stopped to witness the hard work Alex put in every day. When Ken noticed Richard, surprise crossed his face. Mr. Winters, good to see you. Alex turned, his tired expression giving way to a smile. Dad, you're here. Thought I'd pick you up myself today, Richard said, approaching them. How did it go? Alex is making solid progress, Ken reported. His upper body strength has improved significantly over the past few months. Richard nodded, but his attention was on Alex. You looked really focused there, buddy. Alex shrugged, but Richard could see he was pleased by the observation. I want to be stronger, he said simply. As Ken helped Alex transfer from the therapy table to his wheelchair, Richard found himself asking questions he'd never bothered with before. About specific exercises, about progress metrics, about what they could do at home to supplement the formal therapy sessions. On the drive home, instead of checking emails or making calls, Richard actually talked with his son. Not about treatments or doctors or schedules, but about normal things, school projects, music, a movie Alex wanted to see. It felt strange at first, almost awkward, but gradually the conversation began to flow more naturally. Dad, Alex asked, as they pulled into their driveway. Could we go back to Sunshine Diner tonight? Richard smiled. I was hoping you'd ask that. I already called and spoke to Tiana. She's working until 8. Alex's face lit up. Really? We can go? Of course, Richard said, realizing how rarely he said yes to spontaneous requests from his son. How many opportunities for connection had he missed over the years? At 6:30, they arrived at the diner. It was busier than their previous visit, with most tables filled. Tiana spotted them as they entered and waved from across the room. She finished taking an order, then came over, smiling warmly. "Look who's back," she said, giving Alex a high five. "I saved you guys the corner booth. Follow me." As they settled in, Richard noticed how comfortable Alex seemed already in this simple diner, more at ease than he often appeared at the high-end restaurants Richard usually preferred. "The usual?" Tiana asked Alex with a wink. "Yes, please, cheeseburger and chocolate shake," Alex replied, grinning. "Make that too," Richard added. As Tiana moved away to put in their order, Alex looked around the diner with interest. "I like it. Here," he said. "It feels friendly." Richard nodded, seeing the place through fresh eyes. The worn vinyl booths, the slightly chipped coffee cups, the mix of people from all walks of life. There was an authenticity to it all that was missing from the polished, exclusive spaces he typically occupied. Their food arrived quickly, and Richard found himself enjoying the simple meal more than he had any fancy business dinner in recent memory. He watched as Tiana interacted with various customers, remembering their usual orders, asking about family members, offering an encouraging word to an elderly man struggling with his fork. When Michael Jackson's "The Way You Make Me Feel" began, playing on the jukebox, Alex's eyes immediately went to Tiana. She noticed and gave him a questioning look, to which he nodded eagerly. "May I have this dance?" she asked, approaching their table with an exaggerated bow that made Alex laugh. This time, Richard watched with a fuller appreciation as Tiana guided Alex's wheelchair around the open area between tables. She showed him how to spin in place, how to use the chair's momentum to create dance movements unique to him. Several other diners clapped along, and an older couple even joined in, dancing beside them. Richard pulled out his phone and recorded a short video, wanting to capture the pure joy on his son's face. He noticed Grace, the owner, watching from behind the counter, a gentle smile on her face. When the song ended, Tiana brought Alex back to their table, both of them laughing and slightly out of breath. "You're getting really good," she told Alex. "A natural dancer." "Could you teach me more moves?" Alex asked hopefully. "Anytime you're here," Tiana promised. She glanced at Richard. "If that's okay with your dad, of course." "More than okay," Richard assured her. In fact, he hesitated, then decided to share the idea that had been forming in his mind all day. "I've been thinking about what you said about making a difference not just for you, but for the diner, too." Tiana raised an eyebrow, curious. "What would you think about creating some kind of regular event here? A dance night that's accessible to everyone, including people with disabilities?" Alex's eyes widened with excitement. "Like a dance party where everyone can join in?" "Exactly." Richard nodded. "People in wheelchairs, people with walkers, people who move differently. Everyone welcome." Tiana considered this, her expression thoughtful. "That could be amazing. We could move some tables, create more open space, maybe get some local musicians to play." "I could help organize it," Richard offered, "and provide whatever funding is needed." "I'd need to talk to Grace about it," Tiana said, "but I think she'd love the idea. The diner could use more evening business." As they discussed possibilities, Richard felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about fixing problems with money or technology. It was about creating connections, building community, seeing possibilities where others saw limitations. Later, as they were finishing their meal, Grace came over to their table. She nodded to Richard with new respect in her eyes. "Tiana told me about your idea," she said. "An inclusive dance night." "Just a thought," Richard replied. "This place has a special atmosphere. Seems like the perfect spot for something like that." Grace studied him for a moment. "You know, when you first came in here in your expensive suit, I thought you were just another rich guy with too much money and not enough heart. Glad to see I was wrong." Richard laughed, surprised by her frankness. "You weren't entirely wrong, but I'm learning. Well, if you're serious about this dance night idea, come by tomorrow afternoon. I've got some thoughts, and there's someone I'd like you to meet. She patted Alex's shoulder gently. You too, young man. I hear you've got some serious dance moves to share. As they drove home that night, Alex talked excitedly about the dance night idea, already making plans for songs they should include and moves he wanted to learn. Richard listened, a sense of lightness growing in his chest. For the first time since Helen's death, he wasn't just going through the motions of fatherhood. He was actually participating in his son's joy, helping to create it rather than just observing from a distance. And somewhere along the way, he realized he'd stopped seeing Alex's wheelchair as a problem to solve and started seeing it as simply part of who his son was, a dancer with wheels, a boy with dreams, a person whose life could be full of possibility if only the world made a little more room. The next afternoon, Richard and Alex arrived at Sunshine Diner during the quiet period between lunch and dinner. The parking lot was nearly empty, and a closed for private meeting sign hung on the front door. Richard hesitated, wondering if they'd gotten the time wrong, but then saw Grace waving them in through the window. Inside, the main dining area had been transformed. Several tables were pushed against the walls, creating an open space in the center. A small sound system sat on the counter, and colorful paper lanterns hung from the ceiling. "What do you think?" Grace asked, gesturing around the room. "Just a quick mock-up of what our dance nights could look like." Alex's face lit up. "It looks awesome." Richard nodded in agreement, impressed by how quickly Grace had acted on their idea. "You've been busy." "When something feels right, I don't see the point in waiting," Grace replied with a shrug. "Coffee? We've got about 15 minutes before the others arrive." "Others?" Richard asked, following her to a booth while Alex explored the open space, testing how his wheelchair moved across the floor. "Local folks I thought should be part of this conversation," Grace explained, pouring coffee into 3 mugs. "People who work with the disability community who could help us make sure we get this right." Richard felt a twinge of surprise. He was used to taking charge of projects, setting the direction, making decisions, but Grace clearly had her own vision for how this should unfold. "That's thoughtful," he said finally, accepting the coffee. "I usually just hire consultants." Grace laughed. "Well, Mr. Billionaire, that's one approach. But around here, we build community by including people from the start, not just paying for their opinions later." Before Richard could respond, the door chimed and Tiana walked in, accompanied by a young man with Down syndrome who shared her warm brown eyes and easy smile. "Sorry we're a few minutes early," Tiana said. "Thomas's shift at the library ended sooner than expected." She turned to the young man beside her. "Thomas, this is Alex and his dad, Richard, the ones I told you about." Thomas stepped forward confidently, extending his hand first to Alex and then to Richard. "Nice to meet you. Tiana says you're planning a dance party where everyone is welcome." "That's the idea," Richard confirmed, struck by Thomas's direct gaze and firm handshake. "Good," Thomas nodded. "Most clubs have too many stairs and the music's too loud anyway." Alex laughed. "And the bathrooms are never big enough for wheelchairs." "Exactly," Thomas agreed, immediately warming to Alex. "You get it." Over the next half-hour, more people arrived. A middle-aged woman named Valerie who ran a local support group for families of children with disabilities. A physical therapist named David who specialized in adaptive movement. And a retired music teacher, Mrs. Chen, who had experience organizing community events. Richard found himself sitting back, listening as these strangers discussed possibilities. For the dance night with enthusiasm and practical wisdom, they talked about everything from accessible bathroom facilities to sensory-friendly lighting options, from wheelchair-compatible dance moves to appropriate music selections. Alex was fully engaged, offering suggestions and sharing his own experiences. Richard had never seen his son so animated in a group setting before, so willing to speak up and be heard. "What about you, Mr. Winters?" Mrs. Chen asked, turning to Richard after a particularly lively discussion about music. "You've been quiet. Any thoughts to add?" Richard cleared his throat, suddenly aware that everyone was looking at him. Not as the billionaire tech CEO they'd expected, but as Alex's father, just another person at the table with a stake in making this work. "I think you all have this well in hand," he said honestly, "but I'd like to help with the technical aspects. We could use some of my company's resources to create an app for the event, something that makes it easy for people to request songs, find information about accessibility features, maybe even connect with volunteer dance partners." "That would be amazing," Valerie said. "So many of our families struggle with feeling included in community events. Having technology specifically designed for them would make such a difference." As the meeting continued, Richard found himself taking notes, actually writing things, down by hand, something he rarely did anymore. Ideas kept flowing, not just for a one-time event, but for a regular series that could grow and evolve. "We could start small," Grace suggested. "Once a month, see how it goes. If it's successful, maybe increase to twice monthly." "And we could document it," Thomas added excitedly. "I'm good with photography. We could show other restaurants and venues how to do it too." By the end of the meeting, they had a solid plan. The first inclusive dance night would happen in 3 weeks. Everyone had tasks to complete, including Richard, who had volunteered not just his company's technology, but his personal time as well. As people began to leave, Tiana pulled Richard aside. "This means a lot to Alex," she said quietly, nodding toward where his son was deep in conversation with Thomas and David. "I can see it in his face." "It means a lot to me too," Richard admitted. "More than I expected." Tiana studied him thoughtfully. "You know, when you first came in that night with Alex, I pegged you as one of those rich dads who's always busy, always distracted." Richard winced. "That was probably accurate." "Maybe then," Tiana conceded. "But something's different now." Before Richard could respond, Grace called Tiana over to discuss staffing for the event. Richard found himself alone, watching the group from a slight distance. He felt a strange mix of emotions. He was an outsider here in many ways, yet also increasingly connected through Alex, through the shared purpose they were building. On the drive home, Alex couldn't stop talking about the plans for the dance night. "Thomas said he'd teach me some seated dance moves that look really cool," he enthused. "And Mrs. Chen thinks we should have a dance circle where everyone gets a chance to show their moves." Richard listened, smiling at his son's excitement. "Sounds like you made some new friends today." "Yeah," Alex agreed, then added more quietly, "It's nice to be somewhere where nobody stares at my wheelchair or talks to me like I'm a little kid." The comment hit Richard hard. How many times had he witnessed exactly that and said nothing? How many times had he perhaps done it himself without even realizing? "I'm sorry if I've ever made you feel that way," Richard said softly. Alex looked surprised by the apology. "It's okay, Dad. You're learning. We all are." Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself deeply involved in preparations for the dance night. At work, he assembled a small team to develop the app they'd discussed, insisting on including developers with disabilities in the process. At home, he and Alex researched music options and practiced dance moves that Ken, Alex's physical therapist, had suggested might work well with his wheelchair. One evening, as they worked on a particularly challenging spin move in their living room, Alex suddenly stopped, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Dad?" he asked. "Do you think Mom would like what we're doing, with the dance night and everything?" Richard paused, caught off guard by the question. He thought about Helen, her infectious laugh, her fierce dedication to making sure Alex experienced life fully, her frustration with spaces and events that excluded people with disabilities. "I think she would love it," he said honestly. "This is exactly the kind of thing she always wanted for you, for everyone, really. Spaces where differences don't matter, where everyone belongs." Alex nodded, satisfied with the answer. "I thought so too. Sometimes I still talk to her, you know. In my head, I tell her about my day and stuff." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I talk to her sometimes too," he admitted, sharing something he'd never told anyone. They were quiet for a moment, the shared memory of Helen creating a bridge between them. "Ready to try that spin again?" Richard finally asked. Definitely, Alex grinned. But this time you have to dance too, not just push my chair. Richard laughed. I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I, technically, Alex pointed out. But Tiana says dancing isn't about being perfect. It's about being free. So Richard danced, awkwardly, self-consciously at first, then with growing abandon as Alex cheered him on. By the time they finished practicing, they were both breathless with laughter. Later that night, after Alex had gone to bed, Richard sat in his home office, but instead of reviewing business reports, he was looking at old family photos on his laptop. Pictures of Helen dancing with baby Alex in her arms, Helen helping a 7-year-old Alex dance in his first wheelchair, his face alight with joy. Helen at their last family vacation before her illness, dancing with Richard on the beach at sunset. I think I finally get it, he whispered to her, image on the screen. What you were trying to show me all along. The night of the first inclusive dance night arrived with unexpected nerves for Richard. He'd hosted product launches worth billions of dollars with less anxiety than he felt pulling into Sunshine Diner's parking lot, which was already filling with cars. Inside, the diner had been transformed. The paper lanterns from their planning meeting were now joined by string lights that created a warm, inviting glow. The sound system had been upgraded, Richard's contribution, with speakers positioned to create good sound without overwhelming volume. Tables lined the walls, leaving the center clear for dancing, and a refreshment station had been set up near the counter. Grace greeted them at the door, clipboard in hand. Right on time, she said approvingly. We've already got 20 people signed up, and the official start isn't for another 30 minutes. Alex scanned the room eagerly. Where's Tiana? Setting up the welcome table with Thomas, Grace pointed toward the corner where Tiana and her brother were arranging name tags and program flyers. Why don't you go help them? We could use your input on the music playlist too. As Alex wheeled away, Grace turned to Richard. Nervous? Is it that obvious? Richard asked with a small smile. Only to someone who's organized a few first-time events, Grace assured him. Don't worry. However it turns out, it's a beginning. That's what matters. Richard nodded, taking in the scene around him. 3 weeks ago, this had been just an idea. Now it was becoming reality, not through his money or influence alone, but through the collective effort of people who believed in creating something meaningful together. As he watched Alex laughing with Thomas and Tiana, Richard realized that the true transformation wasn't just in the diner, decorated for a dance night. It was in himself, in his son, and in the new connections they were building with people whose paths they might never have crossed otherwise. The music started, and with it, a new chapter began. The first hour of the inclusive dance night exceeded all expectations. People of all ages and abilities filled Sunshine Diner, some in wheelchairs, others with walkers or canes, many with no visible disabilities at all. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, and adults mingled together as the music played, creating a vibrant energy that transformed the simple diner into something magical. Richard stood near the refreshment table, watching in amazement, as Alex and Thomas greeted newcomers, introducing them to others and encouraging everyone to join the dancing. His son moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, his wheelchair no longer a barrier but simply his unique way of navigating the world. Quite a turnout, Grace commented, appearing beside Richard with a tray of mini sandwiches. We're going to need more food at this rate. Richard nodded, taking in the scene. It's incredible. I didn't expect so many people. Word spreads fast in this community, Grace explained. People have been waiting for something like this, a place where everyone belongs, no exceptions. Across the room, Tiana was leading a group dance, demonstrating moves that could be done from a sitting or standing position. Her face glowed with joy as she guided an elderly woman with a walker through a simple hand routine. She's a natural teacher, Richard observed. Always has been, Grace agreed. That's why she'll make such a good nurse. She sees people, really sees them. As if feeling their gaze, Tiana looked up and waved, gesturing for them to join the group. Grace immediately handed the tray to Richard and made her way to the dance floor, leaving him momentarily alone with his thoughts. 6 weeks ago, he would have dismissed this entire scene as irrelevant to his life. A small community event in a struggling diner, people dancing to outdated music, none of the power players or influencers he typically surrounded himself with. Yet now, watching Alex laughing as he spun his wheelchair in perfect time to the beat, Richard couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "Dad," Alex called, wheeling over. "You have to come dance. Mrs. Chen is teaching everyone the electric slide. There's a seated version, too." Richard hesitated, glancing down at his casual clothes. He'd left his usual suit at home tonight, opting instead for jeans and a button-down shirt, but he still felt stiff, uncertain. "I'm not sure I'd be very good at it," he hedged. Alex rolled his eyes. "That's the whole point, Dad. Nobody here is worried about being good. We're just having fun." Before Richard could respond, Tiana appeared beside Alex. "Your son is right," she said, smiling. "And besides, you can't help organize a dance party and then refuse to dance. That's against the rules." "I wasn't aware there were rules," Richard replied, but he could feel his resistance melting under their combined encouragement. "First rule of inclusive dance night," Tiana said solemnly, though her eyes twinkled with mischief, "is that everyone dances, even billionaire tech CEOs." Richard laughed, surrendering. "Well, when you put it that way." He allowed them to lead him to the dance floor, where Mrs. Chen was patiently demonstrating the steps for those standing and the alternative movements for those in wheelchairs or chairs. Richard felt awkward at first, too aware of his body and how out of practice he was. The last time he'd danced had been with Helen years ago, but as the music played and everyone around him moved with such unself-conscious joy, Richard gradually relaxed. He followed the steps, made mistakes, laughed, and tried again. No one judged. No one expected perfection. They were all just present, sharing the moment. By the end of the song, Richard was breathless and smiling. Alex beamed at him from his wheelchair, pride evident in his expression. "See? Not so terrible, right?" Alex teased. "Not terrible at all," Richard agreed, surprised by how much he'd enjoyed himself. As the evening continued, Richard found himself fully participating rather than observing from the sidelines. He danced with Grace, with Mrs. Chen, with Valerie from the support group. He helped serve refreshments when the crowd grew hungry. He even took a turn at the music station, selecting songs that had been Helen's favorites. During a brief lull, Richard stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights nearby. He leaned against the wall, processing everything he'd experienced. The door opened, and Tiana joined him, 2 cups of water in her hands. She offered one to Richard, which he gratefully accepted. "Needed a breather?" she asked. Richard nodded. "It's a lot to take in. All these people, all this—" He gestured vaguely, searching for the right word. "Joy," Tiana suggested. "Yes," Richard agreed. "Joy and connection. I've spent years in boardrooms and at networking events with hundreds of people, but never felt the kind of connection I feel in there tonight." Tiana was quiet for a moment, sipping her water. "Can I ask you something personal?" "After everything that's happened these past few weeks, of course. What changed for you? That first night when you came in with Alex, you barely looked at me when I took your order. You seemed closed off. And now here you are, hosting dance parties and doing the electric slide." Richard considered the question seriously. "I think I was asleep," he said finally. "Not literally, but moving through life on autopilot. Building my company, trying to fix Alex's condition, never really looking up to see what was right in front of me." He paused. "When you danced with Alex that night, it was like someone finally shook me awake." Tiana nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes we all need a wake-up call." "What about you?" Richard asked. "You've put so much into making tonight happen on top of your jobs and nursing school." "Why?" "Because everyone deserves to dance," she said simply. "My brother Thomas spent years being left out of school dances, parties, social events. Not because People were deliberately cruel, but because no one thought to include him, no one made space. She looked up at the stars. Making space for others, that matters to me. From inside, they could hear the opening notes of Michael Jackson's The Way You Make Me Feel, the song Tiana and Alex had danced to on their second visit to the diner. "I believe your dance partner is waiting," Tiana said, smiling as she nodded toward the door. Sure enough, when they went back inside, Alex was near the entrance, searching the crowd. "There you are," he said when he spotted them. "They're playing our song, Tiana." "So they are," she agreed, taking the handles of his wheelchair. "Shall we show everyone how it's done?" As they moved to the center of the floor, the crowd naturally parted, forming a circle around them. Tiana and Alex began their dance, more polished now after weeks of practice, but still with the same spontaneous joy that had characterized their first dance together. Richard watched, his heart full. Other dancers gradually joined them, some in wheelchairs, others moving with various assistive devices, many on their feet. The circle widened, contracted, shifted, a living, breathing community in motion. Thomas appeared at Richard's side, camera in hand. "I've been taking photos all night," he said, "for the website and social media. People need to see this." "Yes," Richard agreed. "They do." As the song ended and another began, Alex wheeled over to his father, face flushed with excitement. "Dad, everyone's asking if we're going to do this again next month, can we? Grace says the diner can host it regularly if we want." Richard looked around at the transformed space. Had Grace efficiently managing the refreshments, at Valerie deep in conversation with parents of children with disabilities, at Mrs. Chen teaching a group of teenagers a new dance, at Thomas documenting it all with his camera. "I think this is just the beginning," he told Alex. "But we need a better space if we're going to grow. Somewhere fully accessible, with more room to dance." Alex's face fell slightly. "But I like it here. It feels like home." Richard quickly clarified. "We'd still have Sunshine Diner as our home base. But what if we created a foundation to help fund inclusive events like this across the city, across the country even? We could start by renovating the empty storefront next door, connecting it to the diner to create a larger space." Alex's eyes widened. "You mean like the Sunshine Inclusive Dance Foundation or something?" "Exactly," Richard nodded. "And it wouldn't just be about dance. It could support all kinds of inclusive community events and spaces." "Could I help run it?" Alex asked eagerly. "I have lots of ideas." Richard felt a surge of pride at his son's enthusiasm. "I think you'd be perfect for it. We could work on it together." 6 months later, Richard stood at the entrance of the newly expanded Sunshine Community Center, watching as people streamed in for the grand opening. The original diner remained intact, but now connected to a modern, fully accessible space designed specifically for community events. Grace still ran the diner portion, while Tiana, now a registered nurse who worked part-time at the local hospital, directed the community center's programs. Thomas managed their social media and documentation, his photography having gained recognition for its authentic portrayal of people with disabilities enjoying life fully. And Alex? At 17, he had become the youngest board member of the Winters Inclusive Community Foundation, bringing his unique perspective to every decision. His confidence had blossomed along with his social circle. The boy who had once been defined by his medical appointments now led workshops on adaptive dance techniques. Richard's company had changed too. Their new adaptive technology division was growing rapidly, developing innovations based directly on input from the disability community. Richard himself had stepped back from day-to-day operations, focusing instead on the foundation work that now felt more meaningful than anything he'd accomplished in business. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, Richard found himself standing between Alex and Tiana, who had become not just a friend but a valued partner in their growing mission. "Did you ever imagine that one dance would lead to all this?" Tiana asked quietly. Richard shook his head. "Never. But I'm grateful every day that it did." Alex looked up at them both, his expression thoughtful. "Mom would have loved this," he said. She always told me that sometimes the smallest moments can change everything. Richard placed his hand on his son's shoulder, remembering Helen's wisdom, her belief in possibilities. She was right, and she'd be so proud of you. As the ribbon was cut and applause filled the air, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a chance stop at a roadside diner to this moment of community celebration, from isolation to connection, from focusing on limitations to embracing possibilities. All because a kind-hearted waitress had asked a boy in a wheelchair to dance, and a father had been awake enough to see the transformation it began. The music started, and once again everyone danced, each in their own way, each belonging exactly as they were.